Hi, everybody. I'm Carol Becker. I'm Dean of the School of the Arts. I'm really quite thrilled to be opening this event on art and activism. And this is part of Year of Water. It's this initiative that has engaged so many aspects of Columbia, the schools, program centers, institutes, including the libraries, even Rare Books, which has an exhibit up right now of books, artist books related to water. And if you haven't been up to the Rare Books collection, it's a great time. There's this most beautiful Carol Walker book that's illustrating Toni Morrison poems about water and things like that. It's very special things. And there's also an exhibit in the music library of water, and everybody's just sort of jumped on the issue because it's so important. So we have an entire lineup of water-related events that are going to be happening here in the spring, from the concerns of tonight of water activism to those of poets and artists and government policymakers and such. We even have the second part of Lenfest Kids H2O, which is a monthly film series dedicated to films related to water for children, and a commissioned composition called Mondo Aqua that's going to be performed by musician Arturo O'Farrill and his Afro-Latin Jazz Orchestra on April 4th at Miller Theater, and he's also going to be giving a lecture on March 31st. He's an amazing activist musician who travels all over the world and performs in really difficult situations, but always with indigenous musicians wherever he may be. He incorporates them into his big band sound. So it's going to be something special. And he's going to be lecturing on his work, as I said, on the 31st. And there's a commissioned dance work called Hydra, choreographed by Phoebe Osborne, that's going to take place outside on Lenfest Small Square on April 18th. So water has captured the imagination of the university, and so also has the urgency to act on water-related issues. The Plastic Bottle-Free Pledge, which we've all been taking, has affected the thinking of faculty, staff, and students in terms of single-use plastic bottles. And usually, 10,000 plastic bottles of water are handed out at graduation every year at Columbia, but not this year. This year there'll be hydration stations, and people will bring their own bottles, and they'll have cups, and there'll be no plastic bottles. So it's really slowly changing the culture and the thinking of the university one step at a time. So in honor of tonight's event, and the presence of Jim Olson from Flow for the Love of Water, and Nadia Gaber from We the People of Detroit Community Research Collective, I wanted to note that the idea to dedicate this year to water at the School of the Arts really began because of issues surrounding Lake Michigan, where I swim every summer, every day in the summer, and because of decades-long conversations that I've had with Jim Olson, who's here tonight, whose life's work has been to legally protect the waters of the Great Lakes and the integrity of the hydrosphere. And his understanding of the fragility of our natural resources and the concept of the commons, coupled with the work of activists such as Nadia Gaber, who's here, inspired me to begin thinking about the urgency of water and issues of water equity. So I'm really so pleased to have them here. And I'm going to turn the program over now to our moderator, urban anthropologist Catherine Fennell, who calls herself Cassie, from the Department of Anthropology and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. And our co-sponsors tonight include the Mailman School of Public Health and the Sabin Center for Climate Change, Law, and the Department of Anthropology. And there's been a lot of interest from student activist groups at NYU and Cornell and the Business School and Union Theological Seminary and all these different places that are concerned with the issues of water equity. So I'm just going to turn it over now to Cassie, and good luck with everything. See you soon.
Hello, good evening. Welcome, and I'd like to invite you to move up closer if you wanted to be closer and be part of the conversation, because we will have an extensive Q&A. Not obligated, but if you felt like it, now would be the time. I'll just look aside. Come on, you're welcome, right?
I'm moving up.
We'll make it easier for you to ask us questions. So thank you, Dean Becker and the School of the Arts, for hosting this event and for inviting me to moderate it. I think it's very exciting. As someone who works in the late industrial Midwest, it's great to see it on the radar screen. Gavin asked me to provide a little context to open up our conversation, and I'm happy to oblige. So, if I were to ask you to name a place in this country that stands at the vanguard of American environmentalism, the first thing to come to mind would probably not be the Great Lakes region. I'm aware of that, or more broadly, the Rust Belt. And I understand why. The area is better known for its deindustrialization, for its disinvestment, for its depopulation, for its brownfields, for its algal blooms, for its vacant and ruined buildings, and for its decaying infrastructures. Of course, the list could go on, and I'm sure that you're aware, or some of you, most of you have probably seen this apocalyptic imagery that's tied to this kind of imagination of this landscape of this region. However, I want to suggest that the work that tonight's speakers are engaged in challenges us to consider an interesting possibility, and that possibility is this: the substantial challenges that come with living in a compromised landscape is generative of political, legal, and ethical stances that we all stand to learn from at a moment characterized by widespread anxiety concerning intensifying ecological degradation. Right? We have a lot to learn from a region which is very close to the challenge and perhaps also the pleasures of thinking with degradation, right? Of inhabiting degradation. And accepting that degraded landscapes are not only our future but our present, and not just in the late industrial space. So with that possibility in mind, I want to bring up our two speakers, right, Jim and Nadia, and they're both people who I think are engaging in work that asks us to think about the potentials of thinking with and living with and accepting that we all are living with degraded landscapes. So, come on. Right, we're gonna start with Jim.
All right. Rather than start here, I'm going to start over here. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Carol, and her husband, Jack, for our long friendship and for the opportunity to be here. Gavin, thank you. Cassie and Stephanie, for all the logistics of not only this program, but of the entire year for this school. And thank you for the School of Fine Arts and the university for this, as I understand it, university-wide year of water. Tonight, I'm going to do the following things. But before I do that, I want to just say a couple of things. One is my background. First of all, I didn't know I lived in a apocalyptic region, but and maybe I should have done more in the last 50 years with these lawsuits that I've been engaged in. But I think the planet is at that stage, and I don't mean to cry wolf, but I don't need to explain why I said that. I don't think to anybody here. The other thing is my background has been a little bit of both academia, beginning with an opportunity. Well, I started out with two public trust cases, one involving a major mining operation in Lake Superior, on the shores of Lake Superior. Well, the Great Lakes are subject to the public trust doctrine, so that became a predominant doctrine in the case. The other one was the development of a Holiday Inn on a mouth of a river on what was thought to be a beach, a public access beach. We lost both those cases. We won a lot along the way, including the recognition of the public trust doctrine on beaches and upland areas where they were of a special character connected with water. But I was so disillusioned after my first 3 years of the practice of environmental law and the dedication I thought I would give to it, that I called a professor, Joe Sachs, at the University of Michigan Law School, the late Joe Sachs. If you don't know his writings, which extend into the realm of art, by the way, he extended the public trust doctrine with a book called Throwing Darts at Rembrandt, which is a fascinating book that I commend to you. Joe took me under his wing for a master's in law, and I spent 3 years driving back and forth with Ann Arbor. It was primarily because of his work that I stand here. I became I guess I became a foot soldier. And that foot soldier took on various environmental cases, and that's been my background, and that is what is behind the things I have to say tonight. Because what I can share is what I experience, and the ideas that I have come out of that experience. But they also come out of an academic piece that started in the 1970s and it has evolved into a number of articles. I don't publish a lot, but I try to publish something that advances this idea of public trust, not so much for the idea, but to empower people with a doctrine, as Joe Sachs recognizes, that could be one of the most powerful tools we have in the 21st century. And Joe saw this in the 1970s when he wrote this law review article on the public trust doctrine in the Michigan Law Review. The next thing I'll say is that tonight's program could not have been high-beamed more than what occurred in the news media the last week. Bridge Magazine and the AP Press announced last week that another 23,000 homes were shut off, or people were shut off from water in the city of Detroit. Yesterday, the governor's office in Michigan reported, again through Bridge and other news media, that the governor was not going to declare an emergency, a health emergency, in the state of, or in the city of Detroit, despite having been requested by the citizens that had been denied access for water since 2014, when the first 40,000 shutoff occurred during the Detroit bankruptcy to make the balance sheet look better. So we're standing here tonight with a governor that rejected, and a governor that is sympathetic and is trying to do the right thing, but rejected the health risk and answered that the citizens didn't prove a health risk. Why on earth would citizens have to prove a health risk before they get a cup of water? And that's essentially what's happened yesterday. That goes to the heart of what I want to say. The public trust doctrine starts with the proposition that water is a commons, and we're going to go through this in a whitewater raft trip here in a minute of water law. But this commons recognizes that it's held for the benefit of people. And if it's held for the benefit of people, the government has the obligation, and under public trust law, as you'll see, if you're going to deprive somebody or impair their right of access to water, as you'll see, it's the burden of proof is on the person who wants to deprive or interfere or impair with the people that have this fundamental right. Okay? That isn't anything like we know of American law. Typically, if you've been wrong, you've got the burden of proof. But when it comes to water and the public trust in water, it recognizes more than rights. It recognizes a relationship of people to a substance called water which gives life. And it's in the recognition of that relationship, which is the status quo. In the law, a person sues another person to shift the status quo and get the award, the injunction, the money. Okay? When it comes to water and public trust, air and water and special property of a special character, commons, the relationship is the status quo. Those who seek to alter the relationship have the burden to demonstrate that the relationship will not be impaired. Ultimately, what I want to leave you with, in addition to some ideas about public water and public justice, is that ultimately the public trust doctrine is a doctrine of sustainability for this planet. And we're going to go through that real quickly right now. And after we do that, I'm going to talk quickly about the Nestlé water case to sort of segue into the Detroit water shutoffs. And then I want to end with talking to you a little bit about a project of flow called a model law called the Public Water Public Justice Act. It's a model law. So here we go. So I live in this area. I live My wife Judy and I, who's with me, we live right there at the end of this bay, right around
Jimmy,
there.
need the mic.
On the river. Oh, excuse me, I forgot. I should talk about it. So we live right here. Oops. Right there at the end of this bay. And flow works in this region. It's 20% of the world's fresh water. Our belief is if we don't get it right with the 20% of water that has not been polluted, these waters, Lake Superior, you can drink Lake Superior, you will not get sick. Okay? I shouldn't give a guarantee with that, but it's very pure water. You see to the bottoms 30, 40 feet down, particularly the upper Great Lakes. It's 95% of our water. Is it something that's a reservoir? No, it's a living body of water that flows from the watershed into the Atlantic Ocean through the St. Lawrence Seaway. At Flow, we were formed after a 9-year case with Nestlé. I represented a group called Michigan Citizens for Water Conservation. And they brought a lawsuit, which you'll see in a minute, to stop bottled water withdrawals, the water withdrawal in mid-Michigan. So after that lawsuit, even though the clients won, there were some very troubling things that were left undone. Flow was formed with the help of Irina Salina, a film director, I don't know if she's still in New York, but from New York, that traveled the world as a young woman, creating the footage for a film called For Love of Water. And she was gracious enough to allow us to use that name and appear to our launching event and show her. It was the second place she showed that film. If you haven't seen the film, it's a beautifully done film. This is what Flow does. We look at solutions that are the systemic threats to the planet. Why do I say that? Up until now, we've had, the United States has had tremendous, powerful environmental laws in the 70s and the 80s. I grew up with them. Since the 80s, they have been weakened, budgets have been cut, even though the laws are still on the books. So what we now see are systemic threats like algal blooms, like PFAs that are in what we call the 6th Great Lake, threats to diversions, oil in the Mackinac Straits, an oil pipeline that could expose 700 miles of shoreline to about $6 to $40 billion of damage. And the state of Michigan won't shut it down, and the line is 67 years old with failing designs. And I won't go into it more. But what we do is we look at the systemic threats that are spilling outside the framework of existing law and finding solutions in a new framework. And here's the new framework. This is some of the activities we're doing: aquaculture, pollution, algal blooms, bottled water, and trying to do something positive that empowers people in Detroit. We did this in Detroit when the shutoffs occurred in 2014. We were trying to figure out how to help the Lydia plaintiff in the original case, in which the court dismissed the constitutional claim and the public trust claim, which we added because it was in bankruptcy, basically. But the fundamental reason was the court construed the law so narrowly that the court missed the meaning of the public trust doctrine and wrongfully dismissed the case. The Sixth Circuit affirmed the dismissal, and so we then started looking for new ways to try to unlock the problem that was just demonstrated by the action taken by the governor yesterday. So we look at things in terms of the hydrosphere. Why? Well, there are water rules for groundwater, there's water rules for lakes and streams and oceans, there's Air, Atmosphere, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Wetlands Act. We have laws for the segments of the water cycle. We don't have a principle for the water cycle itself. And the reality is, everything is upstream. And in fact, with the water cycle, everything is also downstream. So what we try to do is build on the reality that we live in a hydrosphere, the science that is evolving in the hydrosphere, it's particularly advanced because of climate change and the work that's being done in climate change. For example, we in the Great Lakes Basin in 2011, our water levels were beyond the lowest they'd ever been, about 13 inches caused by climate change. 6 years later, usually the cycle goes back up 30 years, 6 years later, the water is at an all-time high. So something's going on. The fact is, climate change is a cause and effect on the Great Lakes, which are part of the hydrosphere. The biggest diverter of the Great Lakes and the biggest cause of flooding in the Great Lakes right now is climate change. So if you're going to figure out how to look at this as a holistic way in a legal framework, our conclusion and belief is that you have to start looking at this as a commons, using public trust principles to make very good decisions. This is Nobel Wisława Szymborska. I love this poem, but just the first line, a drop of water fell in my hand, drawn from the Ganges and the Nile, or the next one, hoarfrost ascended to the heaven of a seal's whiskers. It makes the point that we live in the hydrosphere. This is a recent tool that we've developed in order to frame the discussion here. So, you have private property on one side and commons on the other, and this is a fundamental battle on the planet. Okay, this is at the core of the Detroit shutoffs. It's at the core of the Flint water crisis. It's at the core of bottled water. It's at the core of diversions of water. It's at the core of excessive wasteful agriculture. It's at the core of nutrient pollution that's causing the algal blooms in Lake Erie. So for a framework, water came down over the centuries as a commons, the blue. Private property came down as exclusive ownership, title, deeds, conveyed, assignability, transferability. Water isn't owned by anybody, property is. Up until now, it is my belief that the American legal system has, and our water and law and land policy, has focused more on the idea of regulating private property rights and less on the fact that there are actually limitations on property rights that don't even exist within the bundle of sticks imposed by the commons. If you move private property rights too far this way, the commons are eclipsed. So the job of all of us is to begin to understand the commons. What are the roots? Okay, Justinian Code. By the law of nature, these things are common to all humankind. The air, running water, the sea, and the shores of the sea. Okay? Pretty plain. In the Magna Carta, the Lord's given favors. I'm storytelling, it's not exactly this, but there are paragraphs in the Magna Carta where the common people demanded and received the removal by the lords of weirs, that there were weirs. They didn't have access to life, sustaining food and fish and the access they needed for navigation. Then Arnold v. Mundy in 1821, lo and behold, the Supreme Court of New Jersey recognized that Mr. Arnold did not have a claim against Mundy for stealing his oyster beds because Mr. Arnold didn't own the oyster beds and he didn't have a license from the Crown, and in fact the Crown could not convey a license because the oyster beds and the oysters belong to the public and were inalienable. Okay? And in this case, there are two things. One, the court says there are certain properties that are common property. And these are the ones that are subject to the limitations of inalienability and the burden of proof and the protection from impairment from one generation to the next. So, a couple of points. Every state, under the equal footings, it's called the equal footings doctrine, when every state joined the Union, they received title to the bottomlands and waters, navigable waters, and the lands beneath them. and they receive title to the extent that they can own water, to the water of the state, the natural resources of the state. Okay? So it's public water, it's sovereign water. Riparians on a stream, like the people injured in the Nestlé case, riparians on the stream are common to the stream. So there's a specialized commons recognized with the courts there, and if somebody tries to divert and sell the water somewhere else out of the stream, it breaks the common. It's almost like we had a common law principle in the 1800s that solved the problem of tragedy of the commons. Garrett Hardin's article in 1965, Scientific American. The same is true with well, riparian water. I just talked about that. So the same is true with groundwater. We have 4 doctrines of groundwater in this country. One is absolute capture, which is gives the right of the landowner to do whatever they want, and the neighbor has no remedy, even if their well goes dry. And then reasonable use, American rule, modified American rule, Western allocation, and then there are variations imposed by legislative reform. The point I want to make here is that, going back to this, all of these legal regimes have to do with this. And in the last 50, maybe 75 years, but particularly in the last 20 years, there is an effort to change these rules of riparian and water law and public trust law by expanding the definition of right to use water. An owner of property has the right to use water. There is nothing in the history of Western law that gives the property owner the right to own this water. They do not own the water. Not even in the Western appropriation states. They own water rights based on the legal regime. Each legal regime has a different encroachment on the commons. The riparian systems in the eastern U.S. have a rule against diversion and selling in distant lands. So we have in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut and Michigan a tradition of drawing the line right here. You can't go past that line if you're going to try to privatize and sell water under public trust law or under groundwater law or under riparian law. In the last decade or so, as I said, 15 years, there is an effort to adopt laws and interpretations by courts, including the restatement of torts, it's called. The point, what they're trying to do is get rid of the limitation that protects the commons by expanding the right of private property and allowing severance of water, just like it was a petroleum or an ore body, to sell it and divert it somewhere else. That was at the heart of the Nestlé case in Michigan. It still is. And that's why we began to do this work at Flow. So, in 1892, the U.S. Supreme Court voided a grant by the Illinois legislature of 1 square mile of Lake Michigan and the waters of Lake Michigan to a railroad company to build a big show-off platform for the Columbian exhibition that was going to be held in the late 1800s in Chicago. The Supreme Court said the water is sovereign, the bottomlands are sovereign, it's inalienable, and the doctrine is irrepealable. Sorry, President Trump. Sorry, Governor Whitmer of Michigan or Legislature of Michigan or California. It's irrepealable. This is one doctrine that is like constitutional, although it also comes out of property law. It's a doctrine that is irrepealable. Imagine a doctrine in which each citizen is a legal beneficiary of a trust and has a right to enforce that trust to assure that the water protected by the doctrine is not impaired from one generation to the next, and that it cannot be transferred or assigned to another person for private gain or purpose. I mean, I don't know how you feel. I've been thinking about this for 40 years, and I still feel it in my veins because of how significant this is in this century. The trustees have a solemn, affirmative, perpetual duty. It isn't something to take lightly. The problem with Detroit and Flint was this duty was taken lightly. We had more of a business mentality than an understanding of the relationship of people to water and the obligation of government to protect those people and that community from being harmed. Each citizen is a beneficiary. The courts recognize that you have standing. The rights of the public trust doctrine are paramount. That means above else, above all else. Basic principles: non-alienation, no disposition for private or occupancy for private purposes, the improvement of the public interest. If you're going to transfer it to a party, you have to improve the public trust interests, which are fishing, boating, swimming, drinking water, sustenance, and bathing, health, sanitation. Okay? And you must assure that there is no detrimental effect or interference or impairment. And the government has a duty to account, which means they have to figure this out ahead of time before they authorize the permits. And if something happens, they have to step in and right the wrong and do the accounting to the people. Just like we're all beneficiaries in each of our states. Just like if you don't inherit anything, you've inherited the public trust rights and the public trust doctrine. There are trends to recognize that the public trust doctrine moves up into groundwater, non-tributary navigable waters, and even in upland parklands. Property of a special character can be subject to the public trust. In the Illinois Central Railroad case, the court said it is common property, common public property, like navigable waters is subject to the public trust. So it is an open-ended doctrine in terms of what it can protect, meaning it's dynamic as you move through time. At Flow, we realize that the International Joint Commission governs the rules and decisions between Canada and the United States. And they have two charges under the Treaty of 1909. One is to make sure that water levels are not diminished. That is, they're maintained in some adequate way. Two is to prevent pollution of international waters from one country against the other, or by the polluters in those countries that affect the polluter or the harmed in the other country. So we thought, what a great place to start. So in 2014, we started a dialogue with the International Joint Commission. 3 people appointed by the leader of Canada and 3 people by the President of the United States, and they make the decisions. And so it took us about 2 years, 2.5, 3 years, and the IJC in 2016 adopted the public trust doctrine and recommended as the umbrella backstop principle to address the systemic threats in the Great Lakes. This was a paper victory. We've got lots to do, but the framework now is beginning to be fashioned. So, the bottled water Nestlé case brought a gut reaction by most citizens, and it does statewide. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us what the case is about? Because
yeah, I'm going to go there right now.
Thank you.
Okay. So this case had to do with these 3 lakes. This lake, which is an impoundment of a spring that the old timers that lived there described as a sapphire blue, 80-foot, 20-foot wide flow of water coming up out of the earth, forming the west branch of the Little Muskegon River. Okay, so it flows down like this. The wells went in right here. There were 3 of them, high volume wells, originally about over 300 million gallons a year. Somebody might say, well, that's a drop in the bucket. It is in terms of the Great Lakes or the flow of a large river. But when you're talking about hydrologic systems, every gallon out of a spring or groundwater that feeds a spring is a gallon out of the stream. Gallon for gallon. It's almost as if you might as well put the pipe in the stream or the lake and just divert it. So at the heart of this case was a lawsuit because it was our belief that based on the data and the scientific models and the calculations of the existing flows and levels that were monitored before and during the pumping, it became very clear that we were going to see 18% to 35% in the summer dry season of a drop in flows, and anywhere from 1 to 6 inches, depending on the expert, of a drop in levels of a stream. Why? Spring water is defined by the FDA as water that is hydrologically connected to a lake or a stream. So to put spring water on the bottle, Nestlé and other bottled water companies have to comply with that. So to prove that, they actually have to prove that every gallon pumped out of the groundwater is a gallon out of the stream. So spring water is the absolute worst situation we have in terms of impact. Bottled water is plastic harm, air pollution in making the PET bottles and other bottles. It is physical impact in the headwater creeks and streams, which are the source of life of watersheds. And then, of course, there is this shifting notion of privatization and the water being sold and grabbed for free without being accountable. So in this case, there's what I was talking about. That's just a job. You put a well down, you see the water coming back from the lake or the stream. That's what happens. It doesn't return. This is the year before the case at one of the plaintiff's homes where the grandchildren were in rowboats and fishing and enjoying the stream. The public kayaked and canoed in this area from the 3 lakes up to this area of the stream. There it is, 3 weeks into the trial in the summer of 2003. Nestlé tried to claim that it was nothing but climate. When we did the measurements, the sea level, tying it to all sea level measurements, the experts, the morning this happened, and it continued throughout the next 3 or 4 years until we finally won in the trial court and the appellate court. And now that stream is pretty much back to normal. So here's what happened. Based on the diminishment of flow and levels, the trial court said if the groundwater use is off track and or out of the relevant watershed, this is respecting the commons of the stream again, that use cannot reduce the flow to the riparian body, meaning a lake or a stream. Okay? The Court of Appeals said, no, even though the Supreme Court says that's the test, we're going to invent the reasonable use balancing test, and they erased the out-of-watershed non-diversion principle that protects flows and levels. So what happened there was they shift, you know that circle I showed you, the property in the blue, that case did what? It shifted private property rights to sell, from use to sell, and shifted them into the commons. And that is one of the issues that we're addressing with the work in Michigan in the courts and in the legislature. So I'm going to move right into this, and if I can have 5 minutes, I'll finish, or I don't. Okay. So I'm going to just leave this commons idea and with this thought. With Detroit and Flint and water shutoffs, there was a case in New Jersey in 1987 where water in a public water supply system, because it came from a public river, which was public trust water, and went through a public trust or through the public water system, it was held that the public water system and the water and the proceeds that went into the water department's bank accounts was held in trust. The communities had taken the money and put it in the general fund, and the court said you can't do that because this is all subject to public trust, citing back to Joe Sachs's 1970 law review article. So I leave you with this idea of hydrosphere, this commons and public trust as a framework in which we can begin to make meaningful decisions that people understand and that they have the power to protect citizens who are the beneficiaries of these legal rights and interests. I have on the table in the back our proposed Public Water Public Justice Act. We can talk about it later if you'd like. This is a proposal to connect and stop the free water that goes to bottled water companies and send that financing to the cities to promote the justice where people have been denied access because of health or because of water shutoffs, so that doesn't happen anymore. We're connecting the dots and removing the inequity using the commons doctrine. Thank you.
Okay, hi, good evening. Just thank you again to all of you for coming, to Jim and to Cassie for engaging in this conversation, to Gavin and his team for organizing, and to Dean Becker and the university for dedicating the year to water. I think it's become something of an unexpected prism to look at the social and political emergencies we're living in, and I'm excited to talk with you all about it. I've been asked to speak about activism that's happening in Michigan, and I'm going to focus on what's happening in Detroit because I think, for one, it's gotten a lot less attention than Flint, and because it really is the epicenter of the structural conditions that have precipitated the crises all across the region and gets at many of the core social, racial, and environmental justice questions. So in the few minutes that I have, I'm going to just start with a broad context about Detroit and the regional shifts and explain some of the city's decline. Second, turn to activists and their advocacy against the shutoffs and for affordability, and turn to the research wing of those advocacy efforts. And lastly, if I have any time, I'll share a little bit about my own work and what an anthropologic approach to water can teach us about race, space, and the future of American cities. So Detroit today is often described through a tale of two cities framework, where you have the revitalized downtown and a midtown corridor set against the scarcely populated, sprawling neighborhoods and their 80,000 some foreclosed homes. Set against the shining steel of the GM headquarter buildings, these abandoned brick two-stories in various states of disrepair attest to the loss of both livelihoods and liveliness across the city. There's much that can be said about the origins of this urban crisis, as described by the historian Thomas Segru, and in many ways those historical conditions are being reproduced in new ways today through water. So the shortest version of that story is that decades of post-war policy, racial resentment, and suburban development have siphoned property taxes and political power out of the city of Detroit, which at the same time structurally, or better yet infrastructurally, has subsidized that process, which is commonly referred to as white flight. What's happened is that as the suburbs are growing, the city is shrinking. And that can be represented in graphs like this from a group of sociologists in Germany, which show these sharply diverging trend lines between the city in bold compared to the suburbs, where the city has seen massive declines in population, jobs, and housing, while its levels of vacancy and demolition skyrocket, just the opposite of the suburbs. It can be shown in maps like this from our community research collective, where the black lines outline the districts that were stripped of their political power and authority and placed under emergency management. Emergency managers are unelected, unaccountable, politically appointed financial managers who are given power to override city council. They can rewrite contracts, they can violate union agreements, they can reorganize debts, and they basically are given power to run a city or a school district as the governor sees fit. So on this map, the colored dots represent the population by race, and you can see how clearly majority black districts have been systematically stripped of their political power. Of the residents placed under emergency management in Michigan, 73% were black, although the black population is less than 15% across the state. And it was, importantly, the emergency manager in Flint who decided to draw from the Flint River water rather than pay for water that they had been buying from Detroit for 50 years, and neglected to even pay the $100 a day for treatment. The siphoning of the political power from the city is also reflected in the restructuring of the water department, moving from the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, or DWSD, into the Great Lakes Water Authority. This happened, I think, 3 years ago, which cut the city's representation in half, even though it is Detroit that built the regional system and remains responsible for all of its debts. Here's a look at that expansion through water infrastructure. So DWSD has grown over the course of the 20th century to become one of the largest water and wastewater treatment systems in the world, Today it serves more than 3 million people in Southeast Michigan, providing water and sewer services to more than 125 separate suburban municipalities. And Detroit sells water to those municipalities at a wholesale rate, and then each municipality sets their rates and marks it up to a retail rate, as you can see kind of represented in this bubble graphic for scale, and they keep those profits. There's also, not shown here, but a major split in how the sewer rates are apportioned, so that Detroiters are responsible for 83% of the sewer costs for the entire system, and that of course is split against the residents who are the least able to afford it. So while the Tale of Two Cities narrative has a lot of truth to it, I think it's really essential to situate the conditions in Detroit within a historical and regional account to really grasp how this came to be, and also how it could be otherwise. In doing this research, we found a quote from the DWC manager in 1955, who warned that if Detroit allowed itself to expand into all these suburban communities, it would bankrupt the city. Obviously, he was overruled. But in 2013, the city did declare bankruptcy, becoming the largest US city to do so, and it scrambled to find ways to cover its expenses and restructure those debts, much of which were accumulated on the back of the water system, considered a central city asset. One of its most dramatic moves was to shut off water to anyone who was 60 days late or $150 past due on payment. So in 2014, the first year of this strategy, the city disconnected 33,000 households, housing on average 3 people each, from service. That's nearly 1 in 5 of residential accounts in the city. These shutoffs have been absolutely devastating for the families affected, but I don't want you to just hear it from me as a scholar, activist, and ally, but from those who've been doing the work on the ground day and night all of these years. So this video, it's a short clip. It's not a video of people living without water, because I'm conscious of putting poverty on display like that, especially when water and water insecurity are so intimate and so stigmatized, and because we have little time. But instead, these are some of the founders of We the People of Detroit talking about the work that they've done and what they've seen delivering emergency water through the water rights hotline that they set up in 2014.
We got a call in the early stages of 2014 where there was an entire apartment building in the city of Detroit where the landlord had failed to pay the water bill for this entire building of units with people and elders and mothers with multiple children trapped in this building with no water and sanitation.
First, it's demoralizing. I mean, not to be able to get up in the morning, to brush your teeth and just to walk and take care of your basic hygienes is inhumane. And so that's one of the first things that you experience when you don't have water.
If you look at water disparity and insecurity across the state of Michigan, what we know is it varies from community to community.
And so when the water shutoffs rolled out in Brightmoor that summer, I had a lot of children, more specifically little black boys, who would come and they would say, "Can we just get some water out your tap?" You're the outside faucet, right? And so, you know, kids usually just want to lean their head down and drink from the faucet and keep moving. But they were bringing jugs. And so as they were bringing jugs, it became abundantly clear how devastating the water shutoffs impact was having on families.
We actually paid a water bill of a woman whose brother had died that day. They didn't have running water. And then she told me a story when I delivered the water to her, that she's watched an older gentleman with a wagon walk daily with empty bottles, take his wagon to a store that allowed him to fill up his bottles and take them back. And she's watched him do that for 3 or 4 years.
So in the face of a lot of criticism, the city argued, and it continues to argue, that this was just a tool they were going to use in the beginning after bankruptcy to get people to come back in and restart their accounts, because there was lots of erroneous billing. Some people didn't receive bills at all in the years leading up to the bankruptcy, which again puts this in perspective, and that then they would stop doing it. But 6 years later, the shutoffs have continued every year unabated, and they're even on the rise. The city argued and continues to argue that it cannot afford to provide services to those who are not paying, but somehow they were able to afford giving commercial accounts a pass, even when they were holding thousands and tens of thousands and even $500,000 debts and unpaid bills, and were drawing water at much higher volumes than any resident. The city has argued that what it's doing can't be called a public health hazard because there is no data that proves it. But at the same time, the city has not done a single study or issued a single report about the effects of this practice. I'm going to come back to the health issue in more detail, but if that's starting to sound a lot like Flint, it should. In Flint, the willing negligence to study the public health hazard of making the shift in water policy from the beginning had some public officials drawn up on charges of manslaughter. If anything, it just raises major questions about how much trust we can place on these public agencies to keep us safe, and that's one of the major consequences and lasting effects, I think, of both Flint and Detroit. So activists have pushed against every one of those arguments. Community groups organized under the People's Water Board Coalition have been fighting the shutoff since 2014, and Michigan Welfare Rights has been pushing for affordability in the city a decade before that. No one in all this time has actually argued for free water, but to be charged a rate that people can afford. The city argues it can't implement the water affordability plan that activists introduced and the city council passed in 2005, but the data proves them wrong. And National Utilities economist Roger Colton authored several studies showing that the city, which says they would lose too much money, would actually gain $36 million in revenue annually if it made water affordable by structuring the rates per income class, because that way more people would be able to stay in the system and pay what they can. In 2014, the UN was called to Detroit by the activists to review the situation, and they affirmed that it was indeed a human rights violation. And what's more, they attested that Detroit has become the first major city in the world to radically regress in its achievement of the human right to water and sanitation. That's especially ironic and tragic in a city built along the Great Lakes, the world's largest source of fresh water. So to put affordability in context, water rates in the city have been increasing steadily for more than 10 years, and they're now just behind Flint's at some of the highest in the nation. This graphic actually isn't even the best because it just shows costs, but not costs as a percent of income, and that's actually how affordability is measured. So the burden of these bills becomes even more extreme when you're talking about some of the poorest big cities in the country. The rates well exceed the human rights threshold of 2 to 3% of household income. Now Detroiters pay between 3 and 21% of their household income on water, averaging 10%. Also, that data was from January 2015, so Flint residents were paying those highest rates in the country for toxic Flint River water while the city and the state were telling them it was safe with bulletins like this. And even after the crisis was exposed, they were asked to keep paying the highest rates in the country for water they could not drink. 7,300 households there are still shut off for non-payment since the water crisis began. Meanwhile, property values have plummeted, and many believe they're not even allowed legally to sell their home until they have been fully abated and all of the pipes replaced. In Detroit, those who couldn't afford their water often found that it was added as a tax lien to their property and precipitated many of the tax foreclosures that we saw throughout the neighborhoods. So here, our research collective used tax foreclosure data leaked to us by a whistleblower to map the geography of those foreclosures in light of the water crisis. And here again, that tale of two cities narrative appears, where you have the water-precipitated foreclosures in the outlying neighborhoods, sparing that central commercial corridor. The resonance between Flint and Detroit was surprising even to the activists at the time. So that summer, 2015, the People's Water Board organized a walk from Detroit to Flint, this water justice journey. We walked every day for 7 days, sleeping in churches at night and marching with people of various ages and abilities in the hot summer days of July. We carried the banner you see on the left the whole way, and on the right you can see a mural done by 2 artists of the Raise Up Collective on a public water tower that reads "Free the Water." Those artists were served felony charges for politically motivated graffiti and faced up to 4 years in prison and fines of $75,000 each. So a lot of organizing went into I guess, having those charges dropped, they served probation and community service. But as an aside, I mention it because though it's relatively easy to turn your water back on, many don't because they fear not just fines or a citation, but felony charges because it could be interpreted that they're tampering with critical infrastructure under Michigan state law. So ironically, in this sense, it is because water is public or state-owned that the public fears claiming their access to it. Photos from our water justice journey. We began with a native-led dedication ceremony at Ed Dwight's Gateway to Freedom statue on the Detroit River facing Ontario. We carried a pail of sacred water shown in the top right corner, pulled from each of the Great Lakes and the Detroit River. There were town halls, rallies, teach-ins, as well as prayer ceremonies, art builds and tweet storms, even a water justice choir, the Flowtown Review, reworking classic Motown songs into protest tunes. I won't repeat any of them. The whole effort was designed to raise the point that water safety and water affordability are inseparable and that they are affecting communities all across the state. But it's not just Michigan. So this is a study from Michigan State University that estimates that 36% of Americans will not be able to afford their water in 2022, and that's 3 times higher than it was just 3 years ago. So that's striking, and even by this study, it well underestimates affordability because they use the EPA standard of 4.5% of household income rather than the human rights standard. So if we go by that, it's actually higher than 36% 2 years from now. This should change how we think about water poverty all around the world, and certainly here at home. It is and increasingly will be a major driver of the housing crisis we're seeing in growing and shrinking cities across the country, just playing out in different forms. So I just wanted to talk about the Community Research Collective that was founded by We the People of Detroit, because it's been a main branch of our activism in response to this claim that there is no data, so there's no crisis. Knowing, as you all probably do, that citizen science in Flint made all the difference in those issues becoming recognized, legitimized, and acted on. So in 2015, we brought together activists, residents, artists, academics to respond to the needs of the community through research that's modeled, done, designed by and with and for the residents of the city. Many of the graphics I showed actually are from Mapping the Water Crisis, a book that we published collectively in 2016. And I want to very quickly talk about some of our efforts to study the health effects in the city, since this is on the governor's desk, as Jim mentioned, right now. So the first was trying to assess on an emergency basis the scale and severity of the shutoffs and whether and how there were urgent public health needs. And so to do this, we used a toolkit from the CDC called the CASPER that's designed to gather rapid and reliable data in the event of a disaster. It's no small irony that this is the type of toolkit that you have to turn to in community because it's cheap, it's rapid, it's designed to be deployed on short notice. And we trained over 40 community members to participate in the sampling, as you can see, and together we knocked on over 700 doors across the city collecting data. When we mapped our kind of random samples against the shutoffs, as you can see, we looked at neighborhoods with high, medium, and low prevalence of shutoffs. We knew we'd have to do this to avoid allegations of bias, though it does dilute, if you will, some of the statistical power and authority of the study to specifically make causal relationships to the range of health impacts that people reported to us and the specific incidence of a shutoff. We did find a baseline picture of high incidence of shutoff and shutoff notices, so 26% of people that we contacted, including 5% who were without water, living in their houses at the time of contact. We found long length of shutoffs, so an average of 10.4 days that people were living without water in their homes, contradicting the city's claim of 24 hours. Another surprising finding was that 51% were using bottled water as their primary drinking water source, including 29% who would only drink bottled water, and who were spending on average $56 a month on that water, diverting money from their household income for food and other necessities, as well as siphoning it from the public system. So ironically, many are doing so with their food stamps or public subsidies. So again, we have a system that's starving the poor to subsidize Nestlé. In 2016, the county agency health authority released a statement calling for a moratorium on shutoffs to all vulnerable populations, households with infants and children, the elderly, people who are pregnant or breastfeeding, people with disabilities or requiring chronic medical care. And based on their recommendations in our study, more than 82% of households in Detroit would have been protected under that health exemption criteria alone. So just to say, these results capture only those people who have stayed in their homes and who were at home when we came by. So even that too likely undercounts the crisis. Not to mention we used the latest census data, which was 2010, so that misses the waves of devastation that occurred from the 2008 housing crisis, financial crisis, and the 2013 bankruptcy and tax foreclosures. And that vacancy affects the experience of poverty, what it takes to get water in a food desert with poor transportation, covered in snow, and so on. But it also affects our ability to do research, particularly in the rear view. And that's why the burden of doing this work was on the city from the beginning, because they were in the best position to enroll participants in a prospective study that could follow people wherever they may be forced to move. We collaborated with research at Henry Ford Health Systems on this study, where they were able to access their hospital admissions data and look at water-related illnesses, specifically skin, soft tissue, and GI infections, and link them to the geographic shutoff data that we had that was linked to us. And they found that not only were people with those water-related illnesses 1.5 times more likely to live on a block with shutoffs, but that relationship was also true in reverse, and that it persisted even after controlling for demographic vulnerability. This study was never published after an extremely contentious set of political discussions between Henry Ford Health Systems and the mayor's office. So then we did another study looking to establish whether all the emotional symptoms, agitation, trouble sleeping, nightmares, depression, anxiety, were in fact an effect of the water shutoffs. And the way we did it was fairly novel. I won't go into details, but we wanted to create a scale of water insecurity that was ethnographically grounded in the practices of water use behaviors and perceptions that in the community. And then we weighed that against a widely used quantitative measure of mental health called the Kessler Psychological Distress Scale. And we surveyed 100 low-income residents at this food pantry in the Brightmoor neighborhood and did find a statistically significant causal effect, not only among those who had been shut off, but among all of those who said that their water bills were not affordable. And when we talk about this in community, of course, we say this is the part where we tell you what you already know. You know, being stressed about paying your water bills or not having running water will affect your mental health. But we also uncovered some striking changes to water-related health behaviors. So 1/3 of these low-income women reported that they collected water from an undesirable or dirty source, and more than 80% worried they would not have enough water to meet their needs and were drinking water they believed was unsafe. You also had 3/4 fearing that CPS might take their kids away if they found out that they were living without water. So you have a lot of people who are living underground rather than getting in line for any kind of government assistance, even if it were sufficient, which it's not. So why do this research? I talk about it in a paper in the Harvard Health and Human Rights Journal, where I look at the lack of a legal right to water at the local and federal level, because access to water and sanitation is not a constitutionally protected right of citizenship, and nor is there a mechanism for enforcing the international human right to water in the United States, which didn't even sign on to that resolution. I argue that these citizen science efforts, like in Flint, may be able to put legal pressure on public interest and public health provisions of city and state charters, but they're also limited by the structural constraints and scientific conditions that I've tried to touch on. But ultimately, human rights are not just legal claims, and the studies do support us in making ethical demands both within and outside the law. So quickly, in my larger book project, Life After Water, I examine these water crises in light of the economic and environmental emergency that we're now in. And I describe the social movement strategies for resisting this era of public health austerity as I theorize the politics of water in an anti-Black climate. I wanted to show this image not only because the Detroit Light Brigade is doing some really beautiful, sometimes quite disruptive public art installations, and I know there are many artists in the room, but also because in my research and writing, I take this phrase really seriously, and you see it in water justice struggles around the country and around the world. And I try to look at what water can teach us about the contemporary politics of life. Among other things, if water is life, then making Black Lives Matter is also a matter of protecting water. and the ability of a major city to take away or contaminate that access, and through it to also pollute basic access to food, housing, and education with no rights protections, exposes the level of austerity that we're living under and the uneven but interconnected life and death stakes of that structural vulnerability. So you have Flint, still dealing with the water crisis, where public health officials falsified, covered up, or simply ignored the health impacts. And then you have Detroit, where the city experimented with shutting down the public health department altogether for a few years, which is shown here. This is an actual picture of the building abandoned and wrecked by water damage. You have Nestlé bottling water for free that looks clear but isn't treated to EPA standards, a township over from where Flint residents can't drink the water from their taps. You have the National Guard delivering water an hour's drive from where a crew of local police officers are sent to escort private contractors, cutting off access to poor families with children. You had just last month uranium waste spilling into the rivers in the south, and plumes of toxic PFAS foam washing across the lakes in the north. So in my work, I think with water, in the anthropologist Marcel Moses' sense, as a total social fact, and I discuss these coincident crises as emerging from the same well of social and political conditions, but flowing across them unevenly. I look at the environmental and material legacies of racial capitalism and the toxic industrialism through these social hydraulics, following water as an object and a method of inquiry. And through water, I trace the connections between the racialized sanitation discourses that organize the spatial arrangement of 20th century cities and the securitized environmental discourses that are emerging to manage the 21st, arguing that the old biopolitical logics of order, wealth, and health cannot address these diffuse, intersectional, and interacting forms of insecurity that we have inherited. If you're interested, I have a paper coming out that looks at how the practice of redlining, decades after having been ruled illegal, is back with a green new face in the city. In these redevelopment plans that envision blue infrastructures in the place of quote-unquote unviable neighborhoods, residents fear that they effectively are being displaced and replaced by water. So I discuss how the city uses the shutoffs and their fateful blue markings to do this, but I also pay attention to the improvisational infrastructures that people are constructing to make do through a political theory of the blues. So that's called From Redlining to Blue Lining, and I hope it will be in Space and Society soon. No talk on activism would be complete without telling you all how you can get involved. So there's Mapping the Water Crisis is available on our website, wethepeopleofdetroit.com. You can get the ebook for, I think, a $12 donation, or you can support the work in other ways. It's all community funded. You can also connect to the People's Water Board Coalition or Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, who have really been leading the charge on this work. And if I believe this week, the People's Water Board will be circulating a petition to get as many signatories as possible to demand that Governor Whitmer declare a public health emergency and step in to stop the water shutoffs. So there's also information about what's happening, not just in the Great Lakes, which I agree, I think is a kind of an epicenter of environmentalism for our late industrial age, but also information for what's happening around the country and around the world. And I hope that you'll leave thinking something about how some of this work and some of these struggles intersect with the work that you or a group that you're with is doing. And please look me up if you'd like to be in touch about that.
Nadia and Jim, we have a little bit of time, but I want to make sure that there's also time for you to ask questions. So I'll start off with a few questions, and I'll hand it over to all of you, and I hope that you have some inquiries and some suggestions for that. First, I wanted to start off, we know a little bit about the Flint crisis, heard a little bit about the bottling, and I wonder if you can tell us what's important for people to understand. What do people get wrong when looking at these cases? What do they not understand about the water shutoffs, the crisis, or the bottling that they need to understand in order to have a conversation that will move us away from this kind of method?
Well, I think from our research, and what I tried to say earlier is that we have to start with the understanding that water is public. And from there flows the reality that any government action concerning something public is subject to the Constitution, and it gives you a way to get at due process and equal protection.
I think it's the false narrative that these are exceptional cases. I think the amount of effort that it took to get Flint from this place in 2015, when we had a group of folks just walking there and had a demonstration of about 50 people at City Hall, what it takes to get from there to this very national, internationally recognized crisis was just a set of exceptional circumstances around how clear-cut the case was, how obvious the government's negligence was. You know, a paper trail, you had kids who were directly impacted. It was just such a clear crisis, and I think it crystallized a lot of these underlying structural issues, but it's not unique in the sense that those issues really are present, not just across these cities in Michigan, but really across the country. And lead pipes, for example, are the mainstay of water infrastructure systems across the country. And they are almost all outdated. They need to be ripped up and replaced in every major city in the country. But where is the financing going to come to do that? And I think if anything, maybe Flint was, you know, a case study of what happens when we continue down this model of cost cutting, and thinking everything according to the bottom line of immediate interest, and don't have a proactive thought about what's really important socially. And so hopefully it kind of opened that up, but the misperception would be to think that that's unique.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so, you know, one of the things that you'll get when you know, it's all very fine and well to say water is a human right or water is public, right? But you will get pushback, especially in austerity contexts, where there are bean counters who will say, that's great, you know, water should be a human right, but we've not signed on to that, or water should be the commons, but there are very influential private property owners and corporations that can bottle it. And also, it costs us money to provide this service. How are the folks you're working with imagining the problem of affordability, how to work with public infrastructures to actually address, you know, declining infrastructure costs, the cost of delivery, apart from just demanding that the human right is recognized? Like, how do they address this problem of affordability?
Well, the water affordability plan, as I mentioned, actually has a few good economic studies that show that the city will save money if they implement it. So a bit like the public health claim, you recognize that on its face, it's quite thin. They say they can't afford it. They would actually make more money if they had an affordability, so you know that there's something else happening. So I think even on the surface, we have to question when the cities say, we can't pay for this. And then beneath that, of course, the way that that debt was apportioned and the inequality in placing a system-wide debt on the backs of Detroiters, vacating the city, removing all of its, not just property taxes because of people buying houses out in the suburbs, but state tax revenue used to also be shared based on proportion, and that no longer happens. So the state has total discretion in how they allocate money to the cities, and they've withheld most of the funds that used to go to support Detroit because it was supporting the rest of the state and building infrastructure. So practically, I think from the activist perspective, it's just about making the claim that this is a reasonable solution, it actually makes economic sense, and it's morally the right thing to do. And they haven't actually argued for free water, which I think is something that they could do, right. But they actually haven't done that. So I think they've actually been really strategic in making a straightforward and reasonable claim, and then also doing this work, like in Mapping the Water Crisis, of describing the historical transformation through water that has really undercut the city's political power, and it's a huge issue, especially around each election season.
Jim?
Yeah. So when we did the work on the Public Water Public Justice Act, what we discovered was that, and you've probably all read about this, but Nestlé doesn't pay anything for the water that they bottle. The Dasani, the Pepsi and the Coca-Cola, when they get water from a public water system, they're getting nonprofit rates which are shared across all the users. They convert that use rate and service rate, put it in a bottle and convert it to high profits, and they don't share the profits. They get the benefit of shared costs, they do not share the profits. Nestlé gets all the profit. They pay an administrative fee, that's just about it. And it's all public water. So to connect the dots, what we came up with was, to the extent that bottled water is going to be allowed in a state, the state must declare first that the water is public, sovereign. Secondly, that people have a right, because of this sovereign responsibility, to access the water. Not necessarily free, but a right to access it. And that it wouldn't be shut off for health reasons and it would be provided. That wouldn't happen, and or shut off because they can't afford it. So what we discovered was, if you add 25 cents, charge 25 cents a gallon, it would increase, not the bottle, a gallon of water withdrawn from the ground and bottled, either from a municipal system and or a private water well, you would raise somewhere between $250 to $300 million a year. That money would then go into a trust fund managed by a fairly constituted board of local, urban, and local rural people, with some experts, with government people, with industry people, and they would manage it under a system of accountability, notice, hearings, rights of oversight by public service commissions, so that there would be a process of priority, moving money to health issues first, affordability second, or structural affordability. That is, what I mean by that, Santa Fe, New Mexico, has a system where everybody gets 7,000 gallons for, $5-10 a month. I forget what, it's a very low amount of money. And then as you use more, you pay more. And what happened is, the greater users started conserving water, that saved cost for the system. And so I call that structural affordability. Without having an affordability plan, you get to the same result. Imagine if that were in place in Michigan. And in fact, by using this reality of public water and requiring licenses and royalties and putting it into a trust fund, you actually level the playing field so that people in the cities and the rural towns have the water, they're not going to get shut off, and they're not going to have to be insulted by having to buy bottled water. And so it's a way of using the reality of both of those paradigms and moving it into public water with public accountability, responsibility funds, royalties, and managing it in a way that truly prevents the Flints and Detroits of the future.
I mean, these are all, they're exciting and they sound plausible as strategies, but I can't help thinking that there is, long-term effect of segregation in this country, that you have a kind of strong divide between, suburban municipalities and the urban ones that anchor them. And so there needs to be some kind of work of convincing, right? Convincing the folks outside of Wayne County that they should be, care about the water. And so how do you see the work of the activism you're doing and the legal arguments you're making in convincing folks who are not immediately affected by the scarcity of water? How do you make that argument to them?
Well, first of all, based on what we find in Michigan is that most of the public, even though they're not affected, when you do the surveys, are in their gut opposed to water being free and privatized and sold without being accountable. And secondly, they want to see, generally, good public water systems, and everybody is going to be facing the same problem as we move into this century. That's an educational piece for everybody. But what we're finding is that and yes, there's a lot of work to do in the legislators, with legislatures and communities, and that's part of the Public Water, Public Justice project that has been recently funded for a group called Water for All in Michigan, and a bunch of organizations. And what we're doing is we're making people realize that the 80% federal funding that used to be granted to communities up until 1998 when Bush II converted it to low interest loans, 80% feds funded, okay? The new proposal of the Trump administration is to drop it to 20%. And where's that money going to come from? The idea is that it's going to come from putting pressure on local governments to privatize water systems, which we all know will increase rates and reduce service. I mean, that's what most of the reports are saying. So a lot of people are understanding this. We have rural towns in Michigan that can't afford the water either. 500 people in a town are ordered to put in a new $1 million water tower, let's say. I know an example like that. They can't afford it. And so everybody is in the same boat here. And that, I think, is the leverage.
Yeah, if I can just.
We're all Detroit. We're all Flint.
Well, Cassie has a great piece on that. So yeah, if I can just add, I mean, you're right. Like the answer to your last question was actually, well, you know, that bubble graph of how the suburbs buy the water at the wholesale rate and they mark it up to the retail rate. Well, if we had a system where everyone just paid equitably into a shared distribution of costs, then these cost recovery strategies wouldn't be so discriminatory. But it's very hard to go backwards and re-legislate those contracts and convince people to buy debt, you know. So I think that's the first thing. I think secondly, one of the People's Water Board Coalition activism efforts early on was actually to do suburban outreach. So they would go to these communities, they would go to churches, they would say, bring us to talk, you know, to your local group. And I think a lot of people just didn't even know this story. They didn't really know the details of what was happening in Detroit and the fact that, you know, they may actually be paying high rates or they may be paying low rates depending on where they live, but they don't recognize that none of the profit of that is circling back into the city. So they feel like, oh, I think in Detroit the biggest wrong narrative is that Detroiters just don't want to pay for water.
Right.
And people don't recognize that they're systematically misbilled, overbilled, not billed at all. The meters are inaccurate. And that is just local context in addition to the regional picture I've tried to provide about how unequal what they're being asked to pay is. And I think once people start seeing that, you get a lot of heads turning. You also talk to people about everyone having access to water in church, and it seems to kind of ignite different sympathies. So that's a strategy I think that they've also tried, and that has worked to some extent. I think on the flip side, it's actually interesting in this moment, the other method is a scare tactic. So I think, you know, there's both, we need to all protect our water for environmental purposes, we're all in this together, and that is very true. I think water is really unique and powerful analytic for the crises of this moment because it does flow across jurisdictions. So you can't just say, well, I'm going to pollute the Detroit River, and absolutely the next thing that's going to happen is it's going to end up in the lakes and be in your backyard. So that's powerful. And then, you know, people are really worried about coronavirus. They're really worried about hepatitis A, you know, and the most fundamental principles of stopping the spread of those infectious diseases is hand washing. So then when you have a city that's let 100,000 people go without basic access to water, sanitation, and hygiene, you also kind of get people to start paying attention to the fact that these precarities travel,
Right.
Particularly when the medium is water. So whether through environmental or health, I think, or through kind of charitable Christian sentiment, and you know, I think it has limitations, of course, but yeah, it's sort of an education problem and sort of a political problem.
I mean, that's what I think is so interesting about the medium of water, because you can make that argument about whatever is in this biota, toxins, or, you know, purity, that all flows, right? It can't be contained in the way that you expect to kind of bound properties. So, and then my question is, educational strategies, appealing to Christian sentiment, but, you know, we're in the School of the Arts. I mean, are there representational strategies that you saw more or less effective deployed by the activists to make that argument, this is all our boat, right? Whether or not you recognize that on the other side of the state, this is all our boat, or this boat is coming for you in terms of water scarcity or water affordability. What do you think was particularly effective about the way that the crisis was represented in Flint that made it, you know, animate the entire country in this conversation about this, you know, this danger? And how can we learn from those representational strategies or those kinds of arguments?
I think one of them was just the representational power of numbers and of data. So that's why we tried to focus on data, because we realized it was quite powerful. to just have a graph and show trend lines, and people really respond to that, even if the details are obscure. I think something that you had mentioned to me, which is, I think, absolutely right, when people were holding up these bottles of orange and yellow colored water or filling their bathtubs, and the kids were in it, or that's why I showed that poster, because a lot of, this was 2 years into the crisis, and they're saying, hey, it's safe to drink, have a bubble bath, here's a rubber ducky. And I think the contrast of those two images was quite powerful. And then I think in Detroit, actually, the focus has been more on kind of performative arts as politics, and less on, in a way, it's actually, water's a bit evasive in terms of representing through the visual arts. So one of the efforts was to go to the mayor's house and draw water from the side tap of his house and create like a long chain of people who were then putting that water into jugs and then driving it and giving it to and distributing it to families. So I think there are things like that that, were just symbolically meaningful.
I can't add much, but I think the news media was called in and very effective in the releases that were developed. And Dr. Mona and Nadia, people with real expertise, donated their time and their lives to put together some information that became powerful enough to back up the organizing and the voices.
I want to open it up to the floor because I know there are questions, so please.
First of all, thanks for the work and thanks for sharing it with us. I've been a water lawyer myself for 35 years. I'm the Hudson River Keeper now, and I'm also an adjunct at Columbia, and we just spent the last 2 weeks in my water and energy class talking about issues of inequity. And I looked at the slide you gave on the emergency manager durations, and I noticed about 2/3 of them are over, and I'm hoping, but not presuming, that when local control is restored, there has been some greater move towards equity, and I'm curious to know whether that's actually the case.
Well, so we're actually working on an update to the book. So it was published in 2016. So a lot were still current at that time, and a lot of them cycle. So they go in and out of emergency management, and it's a discretionary power of the governor. We do have a change in the governor now. So Rick Snyder is gone, and Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who's a Democrat, is in. But I think it's unclear. I think what it was, in a way, was just a kind of striking example of what executive authority can do, given these emergency powers. And I think, Detroiters know, given the history of redlining, of segregation, of a kind of stripping of political voice and gerrymandering out their electoral voice, they're really sensitive to what become very clear issues of a kind of takeover of racially concentrated populations that are also economically disinvested.
Yeah, I mean, it's hit and miss from what I've seen. I don't think we have a change in framework, and that's a real problem. And I think one of the things we're trying to figure out is how we all educate and across the board in this country, how we get from the efficiency bottom line, as you put it earlier, Nadia, management of public water and other common systems, to a system that truly understands they not only have an ethical duty, they have a legal duty, either under public trust principles or, for example, in Michigan and other states, there are constitutional provisions that say legislature and the government shall provide laws to protect the public health. In Michigan, we have one of those. We have Article 4, Section 52. Laws shall be passed and government shall protect the air, water, and natural resources from pollution or impairment. So we have some framework, but we haven't really begun to interpret that in some legal way that is actually followed. So it's going to take education, it's going to take a shift. We have to shift from this idea of government as managing commons as a business, to shifting it first and foremost as a commons for the common good, public health, water, and justice, and then as a secondary level, make sure it's efficient. And add this, you know this, climate change, the need to change infrastructure, the need for green infrastructure, the need for conservation across the board. We have a lot of questions that we need to start connecting the dots. So it's not going to just be the emergency manager that's going to solve the problem, but it is important that we have a new framework to avoid that with the massive problems that we're going to be facing.
So it sounds to me that you're suggesting that the kind of future of environmental legal action will be a resuscitation of the commons or public trust oriented?
Well, I think legal actions are already occurring in the realm of public trust and environment. And then in Michigan, out of Flint, the Sixth Circuit just recognizes claims for a constitutional right for bodily injury for some of the people that were exposed in Flint. The problem with that is the threshold of winning a constitutional claim like bodily injury is extraordinarily high. The bar is so high, it's very expensive and very difficult to win. They have the right to maintain the trial. It's not sure where it's going to end up. I think the approach is to move towards the realization that water is public, and that because it's public and because the molecules of water that go into a public water system, like in Detroit, it comes from Lake Huron, and around the country, it comes from the Detroit River. It's public trust water. I mean, this is law. It's not you can't repeal it. And the molecule that enters the pipe in a public system doesn't lose its public trust status, because actually the purpose of that water is to serve the public trust use, which includes drinking water and sustenance. So I believe that we have to begin to understand more holistically that water systems and water are all part of this water cycle on the planet, and we have to start thinking in terms of commons and public trust principles, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a real and concrete way to measure impairment and sustainability of our water systems.
Thank you very much.
Here you go. Shout loud.
The detail, Nadia, that you gave about people paying for bottled water with food stamps was particularly depressing, both because of just the disjuncture between levels of government and just how money is being used. So I was just wondering, is there any movement, particularly on food stamps, like, you know, sometimes there's Medicaid reform in terms of how Medicaid dollars could be spent. Is there any move with food stamps that you could pay water bills instead of paying for bottled water? Or are there other ways? I know, Jim, you brought up the federal government's grants for water infrastructure. Is there any movement in federal dollars on water issues?
Well, there's movement in federal dollars in terms of authorization right now. I think there's something like $300 million they're talking about authorizing. Well, putting in the budget, but it hasn't been authorized. So we have to wait and see how it plays out after the election this year. So that's a political question, but the funding of public infrastructure is going the other way, and that creates a difficulty. One idea that we were actually talking about earlier, and I talked to somebody working at the House Oversight Committee a couple of weeks ago, was EPA grants, clean water grants, community grants, block grants, all have ties and conditions to them. Maybe we need to begin to think about adding affordability, human right to water, accountability, so that there are certain principles, like the statement of social justice principles. There are certain principles that are tied to the funding, just like conditions are tied to the funding to communities right now for infrastructure. I think we have to begin to think about how to add conditions to get to that result that we're talking about.
Really briefly, I mean, no, not that I know of. Actually, Cassie, you might know more about that than I do, but we actually did propose a water stamps and tried to create a political strategy around it. But I think the truth is that we are so far from even moving the city on any of these issues politically, and as Jim said, the funding federally is going the other direction entirely. I just think it's kind of dipping into an empty well, unfortunately. But I do think it doubles down on the point that these are basic, like public assistance programs that we need to be supporting and defending, because they're becoming all the more important for people to cover basic needs, now including water.
Yeah, we're going to have to turn around the federal slide of not funding public water systems. And the states are going to have to figure out how they're going to do it outside of just putting it on the backs of ratepayers. Because you got small communities in Detroit, declining populations, and right now the cost structure of Michigan is cost divided by the ratepayers. And so it's a downward slide, and we have to look for funding outside of ratepaying.
Generally, for stuff like heat and water shutoffs, you can apply, the state will have a program being administered at a local level, and you can apply for a grant each year, but it doesn't solve the larger, or individual grants, right, to kind of mitigate an emergency. Say, for instance, you have someone that's vulnerable in the household, or they're hooked, electricity grants, this is what happens, but it doesn't actually solve the larger issue of affordability.
And I'll just add, because those assistance programs, this is the main counterpoint that the water department is always saying, well, we have assistance programs. They ran out of money in 3 days of opening those programs. So it's just not a sustainable way of doing it. It's piecemeal. And another thing we found doing that study actually was that 40% of people experience flooding on an annual basis in their houses. So when you think about those state emergency funds, which people do access, they're limited. And some of them are lifetime. You can access it once and then it's gone. So people run through those kinds of assistance really quickly, and it just points to the need for more structural affordability just across the board.
Yeah, and the other thing is it's insulting. They can't get the water, and now they have to ask for a handout for water? I think these affordability assistance plans are one more burden for them to walk to the water department, prove their case, fit into the little niches and hurdles and
Oh, absolutely. I mean, talk about representational strategies. 2 years ago, the Detroit Water Department made a big campaign about how it was putting kiosks where you could pay on an iPad from anywhere across the city, and it was going to make it so much easier to pay your bills. So it was very iconic, kind of missing the point of why it's difficult for people to pay their bills.
Yeah, and we before I hand it over to you in the beautiful purple scarf, there is this question that comes up with, wouldn't it make sense to have a kind of neighborhood generator for electricity problems, or and you could imagine someone saying, oh, I'm going to capitalize on having small scale water treatment facilities for a set of houses, right? That kind of solution, but we might want to be skeptical of that, what that would mean.
Hello? Oh, there we go. So this might be beating a dead horse, but the New York State legislature just voted to add language to the Constitution saying that it's a human right to have clean water. And it sounds like that's not enough. So what should they add to the Constitution, or what should be done to drive what you think should be done in public water systems?
Thanks for that question. Two things. One is the right itself, it gives you a right to fight, but it doesn't solve the problem, and the burden's still on your shoulders. And to fight is either advocacy, education, messaging, raising funds, finding some way to pay a lawyer to fight the case to enforce the right. So I think it's good to have the human right, but as the General Assembly noted, when it passed the human right to water, if you look at the record, Maud Barlow and De Soto, the President of the General Assembly at the time of the United Nations, said that we need a public right and a public trust in the water commons. They put it into the record because without protecting the commons and creating the duty on government, it's too difficult to exercise the right. You can't have one without the other, I don't think. So I would add public trust language to the constitutional amendment.
And perhaps a kind of obligatory fund.
The states that have done it, there's 6 states that have language about trust in the Constitution. Vermont passed a law about public trust in water and groundwater. And wherever that exists, the courts feel they have the ability to rule that the public trust doctrine applies. So it has real meaning. It helps courts get over the problem of trying to see how the common law applies by being able to point to a constitution. Wherever that is in international, India, Pakistan, where these issues come up, where there's a constitutional provision, the courts find the public trust doctrine and the human right to water. So it's a very important question that you asked.
Just because I've been working with the state legislature.
Don't apologize for having a question, right?
No, I mean, I wouldn't have gone twice if I didn't have some information about New York, and I didn't want to talk about New York because we're talking about Michigan. And California has done an excellent law about connecting disadvantaged, unincorporated communities to larger systems and mandating consideration of that. So California is doing some good work. Fortunately, in 2017, New York passed 2 laws. One was called the Water Investment Act of 2017, which allocated $2.5 billion for grants to local municipalities, which completely bucks the trend. And per capita is just huge, and then since then they've added another $1 billion, I'm happy to say. But they also passed an even more important law called the Emerging Contaminants Protection Act, which focuses on things like PFAS and focuses on 1,4-dioxane and mandates the setting of limits as low as any in the country. New Jersey and Michigan are also setting those kind of limits. And they've kind of opened up a good sort of Pandora's box by putting this into law, and by doing so, they've really forced the state health department and the local water suppliers to make plans to fix these problems that they're now just reeling with, because even the $3 billion is going so quickly because the problems are so significant. But there's a better legal framework since 2017.
There was a question that Carol wanted me to ask that I want to raise. Where I work in Chicago, there's a lot of apocalyptic imaginations for a reason. Right, the west side of Chicago has been destroyed over the 20th century several times, and with the vacancy that you see on the west side, you also see this kind of soothsaying, like people are going to come back, right? People will come back and maybe repopulate, but people will come back for our water, right? There's this kind of idea. And in some ways, it sounds like what do they call it, cli-fi, like science fiction with climate stuff. But on the other hand, sometimes I want to entertain this. Like, is that a possible future where the Great Lakes becomes like a reservoir for a parched continent? And what would that look like? Or is that kind of insane to even entertain that?
Well, I mean,
as
clearly,
anthropologists,
we just don't know how climate is going to play out. I mean, the winners and losers change from year to year depending on how the weather patterns change. So, I mean, Michigan right now, there's a proposal, I think partly tongue-in-cheek to get the discussion going by a Chicago law professor that basically says, look, we've got so much water in the Great Lakes right now, let's sell it and make a bunch of money and fix our problems. But 3 years from now, when the waters start plummeting, where are you? And the reality is, you probably couldn't, I hate to say this, but if you sold the equivalent of the Chicago diversion, which is 2 billion gallons of water a day, it would only address about 1 or 2 inches of the high water level problem that's going on right now. So and to call it, I mean, I would say water is not a reservoir, because reservoirs are there to use up and to use. So it's not so much a reservoir for the country as a way of, look, I think if we make good decisions about water as commons and use the public trust doctrine to sustain water, we're going to make very good decisions about economics. We're going to make very good decisions about transportation. We're going to make very good decisions about health. We're going to make very good decisions about food. We are talking about reordering our societies and lives with water first. If we don't do that, we're not going to make it through adaptation, resilience, you name it. It isn't going to happen. This is a cultural shift going on. The battle on the planet for water being a commons versus private or keeping it the way it is if we don't shift as a culture towards this common, in practical terms, we're not going to get this solved.
I mean, I think in many ways that's right. I think in many ways that's why water is really interesting. But your question about these kind of apocalyptic futures and imaginations, people do talk about it all the time. That this is kind of paving the ground for, you know, a kind of super gentrification where everyone moves to the Midwest because it is plentiful in natural resources. And so I think in some ways, you know, Detroit is being imagined as this kind of artificial apocalypse where there are a lot of young groups who are doing kind of like disaster prepping and all these kinds of exercises. And in part, it's this imagination about what the future holds. And in part, it's a response to what they've actually been living through, where the city stopped running the lights and doesn't run buses. And you're not really sure if you'll have access to water that the state provides. And so people really have had to make do with lots of kinds of small-scale improvisational infrastructures that run in parallel to the state. Whether they'll have any staying power, you know, remains to be seen. But I think people are testing them out, partly as art projects, you know, partly as political demonstrations, but partly because they're responding to what they've lived through.
Yeah.
But there are efforts in the Great Lakes Basin called Blue Water Technology. You've got it in New York, I'm sure, too. You know, there are think tanks and efforts being made to increase entrepreneurialism around the new resilience, the new culture, the new culture that sustains water and builds technology to get us through this century. And that's very exciting. And I think the Great Lakes is a region that is emerging in that way, and the jobs may look more like that. One idea is take aquaculture, for example. You know, a disaster in terms of nutrient loading and occupying bodies of water with 10 acres of fish cells, fish ponds. It takes away the right to fish and boat and swim that the public has, so it violates this public trust doctrine. But you could take the warehouses and areas in Detroit and re-employ Detroit, not gentrify it, but use the warehouses and you know, grow fish in the warehouses, for God's sakes. Bring people to Detroit that need jobs, that you know, can help feed the world. There's water on the Detroit system. They need customers. So there are a lot of innovations out there, and young people have real opportunities. I don't care what field you're in of study, you have incredible opportunities in this century to rebuild a new society with all the new inventive creativity and jobs that are gonna follow, and that you will lead with.
Maybe we should end on that positive note, right?
Thank you.